Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to tonight's talk, which is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark Summer Lecture Series. Tonight's program is presented courtesy of the Barriger Collection at the St. Louis Mercantile Library and the Grolier Club. And I would like to express our great appreciation to both for their help and support for tonight's event. Tonight's talk ties in with a special exhibit, Travelers, Tracks and Tycoons, the Railroad in American Legend and Life, currently at the Grolier Club until July 30th. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 237-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Collection, our 200-year-old library, and our lecture series, which was first started in 1837, and of course, of which tonight's program is part of. Throughout the program, please feel free to submit typed questions through the Q&A section, and of course, at the conclusion of the talk. We would ask that you use the Q&A section rather than raise your hand or use the chat section. I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speaker to you, Nicholas Fry, who is from the St. Louis Mercantile Library, which is one of our 15 sister membership libraries across the country. It is a special pleasure to have a curator from the St. Louis Mercantile Library speaking here this evening. Nicholas Fry has been the Robert W. McKnight Curator of the John W. Barriger III Historic Railway Collection at the St. Louis Mercantile Library since 2012 and has just celebrated his 10th and a half anniversary, in which time this flagship special collection of the Mercantile has grown tremendously through scholarly outreach, advisory board involvement, and through major acquisitions of rare books, manuscripts, historic photographs, and prints. Mr. Fry has helped build the collection into one of the largest such transportation collections in the United States. He has also started a strong publishing program based on the collection and has spoken widely in railway conferences across the country. Mr. Fry holds advanced degrees from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, an MA in Historical Studies, and an MS Library Science degree from Drexel University. I am so pleased to introduce to you Nicholas Fry, who I know will also tell you more about the wonderful exhibit at the Grolier Club and a connected talk he's also giving tomorrow entitled Tycoons, Men, Money and Monuments at 1 p.m. online. Nick, it's a great pleasure to have you speaking here tonight as part of our lecture series. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you to the membership of the Mechanics Institute. I'm very honored to be here. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So we have the show up. This is one of 3 talks I've been giving in connection with our exhibition at the Grolier Club called Travelers, Tracks, and Tycoons. Not surprisingly, we've broken them up into 3 topics: Travelers, Tracks, and Tycoons. And this was our first topic, and it talked about railroad travel. Journeys on the railroads from the early surveys to the modern vacation. And it's going to take you through items that are currently on exhibition at the club and items that either we weren't able to take up just because of space limitations or they were too fragile to bring up to the club and ship from St. Louis. So the first thing I always do when I talk about railroad travel is I like to let people know what it was like before trains came into existence. And this is from a historic atlas that the Carnegie Institute did in the 1930s on on American history. And this is a series of images they have about the improvements in infrastructure. And this is the rate of travel in 1800. There is only the very earliest bits of the turnpike system. The era of good feeling hasn't started up, so the national road isn't even started. So you're looking at horseback riding, wagons, walking, boats. And this is as far as you could get outside of New York. If you look at one day out of New York, you're going to make Trenton if you're lucky. And I think it helps us in the modern age put this into perspective, how amazingly helpful railroads were to improving travel. So the very first journeys on a railroad are actually not going to be on a railroad, but you've got to go and build the railroad. So the first people who go out and see the sites that are going to be on these railroad lines are going to be the survey team. In most cases, they're going to try and go to places where there's some kind of existing transportation system, a river, not necessarily navigable one, an existing road, anything that is going to make it easier to build a railroad. This is not going to be an easy operation in the middle of nowhere. So you want to have some kind of existing infrastructure that's going to let you bring the supplies and workers you're going to need to build the railroad. In most cases, these surveyors were all members of the United States Army, and not all of them, but very nearly all of them. West Point at the Military Academy was one of the few schools in the United States that actually had a professional civil engineering program. And as part of the era of good feeling, the US government was lending these soldiers out to private and public-private groups that are building railroads and canals and turnpikes to do the surveying work. And concurrently, we're also working on improving the harbors with the same Army-trained engineers. This also is after the War of 1812, so there's a big realization that America's infrastructure was not adequate, not just for trade, but also for defense. So sometimes that's going to pop up as an issue as to why you're going to travel on a railroad. It's not because you're there for fun, but it's because something is not good and you need to get somewhere in a hurry. And so we've got some of these early maps, these early documents from the Army engineers, from the Secretary of War, and some of the early maps you see getting produced. The bottom is a Philadelphia and Reading Railroad topographical profile. That's part of a series of maps we have in the collection that not only show the topography, but also the bridges and other infrastructure that was built to just build a railroad from Philadelphia into the coal fields of Reading, Pennsylvania. Now, these railroads were initially going to be horse-powered, and I could not talk to the Mechanics Institute without mentioning one of the most prominent and important mechanics in the 19th century, Peter Cooper, who helped transition the railroads from a live horse-powered system to a iron horse-powered system. Cooper developed one of the first steam locomotives in the United States, tested on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Among his many projects, that's the one that I always grew up with growing up outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb has always been an exhibit at the B&O Railroad Museum. And I actually took this picture when I was in New York last at Cooper Union. I was happy to see that it was this was not covered in scaffolding, unlike the building at the moment. But Cooper's revolutionary system of a steam locomotive that was both practical and safe to operate, relatively safe to operate, spurred others to do the same thing, and railroads immediately embraced the steam locomotive. It was faster than horses. It could carry more passengers or freight than horses. And that became, if you were going to travel on railroads, you needed it. It became a requirement for railroad development and railroad travel. Americans I think as a people, we start to have an obsession with speed. And part of it comes about because of the need to move quickly for business, for defense. And when steam locomotives show up, it feeds this need to travel as quickly as possible. And that helps drive development of steam locomotives. You want to go as fast as you safely can, carrying as much material behind you as you can. And that's what these designers, William Norris, Matthias Baldwin, all start developing. Mason, and across the river from New York in Paterson, you've got, just dozens of machine shops. Rogers Locomotive Works, Taunton, Massachusetts has locomotive works, and they're all developing passenger and freight locomotives to move people and freight as quickly as possible. So by 1830, this is what we're looking at. Railroads are just getting started. The road network's been improved. The Erie Canal's been opened. And now in a day, you can make it to Havre de Grace, Maryland, if you're going south and west of New York, up to West Point and beyond, up the Hudson River out of New York. It's been a huge improvement, just over 30 years. And the need to serve these cities becomes, for the railroads, an important thing. A railroad is no good if it has no customers. And New York and the other major East Coast cities, having been long established centers of commerce and population since Western settlement of Europeans began on the continent, they were the places where the railroads got started. This is the Hudson River Railroad that becomes part of the New York Central. You have designs that start coming out. There's no standardization in the industry at this time beyond the fact that we are going to have railroads. This is true both in the United States and in Europe. How wide do you want to make the track? The wider the track, the more people and equipment you can carry in your cars, but it's more expensive to build the railroad. And you start seeing competition between engineers and companies over what gauge is going to be used and become dominant in the United States and the United Kingdom. That's going to get settled in the UK by a legal act. In the United States, we're going to let economics basically settle it. Erie, Pennsylvania, which was the endpoint of the New York and Erie Railroad eventually, it had wide gauge lines and it had standard gauge lines. Wide gauge was anything above 4 feet 8.5 inches, and 4 feet 8.5 inches with standard gauge. And you would have to get out as a passenger and physically change cars as you were going between these two railroad gauges. This was not uncommon throughout the country. You had different gauges in Ohio, you had different gauges in the South. And this rapid expansion of the railroad network with no real overarching standards causes problems. Railroad growth is explosive in this country. And you see things like this happening in not just in Erie, but in cities across the United States. And some cities like Erie embrace this disconnect, this physical disconnect, because it forced people off the trains. You had to stay overnight to make the next train because you weren't always going to be able to get, physically walk from one station to the other, or you may have had a delay. This causes a lot of problems for the traveler, and it's not necessarily a lot of fun to travel by rail. It's better than horseback and it's better than stagecoach, but there are issues. And people start to look at this and say, passengers are going to start needing guidebooks to help navigate the sheer number of railroads and the fact that you're going to go into different cities that you may not be familiar with, and you need to know where the station you are departing from is in relation to the station you need to get to. Richmond, Virginia is famous that it had 5 different railroads going into it. In St. Louis here, you had to take a ferry boat across to get from Illinois to St. Louis. There's no bridge, and the train you're going to get on may not have the same gauge. So there's really not going to be any interest in a physical connection. The ferry boat operator certainly doesn't want to promote a physical connection between the railroads. So it's very complicated. So having these guidebooks, which start to develop not just from scenic guidebooks and practical guidebooks, but almost, civic boosterism that tell you about what's going on in the city, what the population is, what industries are in the town. That basically, it's the beginning of the Foder's Guide, or the Lonely Planet Guide. So these Appletons, steamboat and railroad companions become these lifelines for the traveler, and they're going to develop over time into a less comprehensive from a civic standpoint publication, but they're going to become a very comprehensive travel data publication called the Official Guide. One other aspect of the explosive growth in railroads we're going to see is timing. Railroads are going to have to start keeping schedules, because as traffic numbers keep increasing throughout the first half of the 19th century, they're going to need to run more and more trains. You can compensate by making them longer, but you're going to need more powerful locomotives. And even then, you're still just going to need to increase frequency, because your competitors are going to probably begin increasing frequency. And you're going to have to start creating an official schedule. And one aspect that some people may not think about that we went through when we opened this exhibit is twice a year we change the clock. And when your train schedule is influenced by when sunup hits and when noon hits, because there's no standard time yet, that's coming, you're going to have to physically change your timetable for your schedule. So twice a year, you would see these posters on every railroad station in the US that would say there's a change of time coming. And it's, the change between winter and summer times. When the official railroad guides start coming out as the development of the Appleton publications get more comprehensive, you're going to see passenger train schedules mainly change twice a year, and it's going to be April and September to compensate for the change in daylight that's available. Now, I mentioned just general traffic growth and competition. One other aspect of railroad travel is going out into areas where there isn't necessarily a lot of existing traffic or competition or just anything. And you start seeing that initially in what is now the Midwest. It was called the Old Northwest at that time. And younger states were looking at what was going on in the East Coast, and seeing the economic growth and the competition between the great seaport cities for traffic between the Atlantic seaboard and the interior of the country. And they start realizing that they should probably investigate and invest in railroad infrastructure within their own states to help promote economic development and settlement of their own lands. For the state, you have more people, you have increased political voice in Washington, you have increased economic strength, and you're going to want to do that because your neighbors are going to be doing the same thing. In the 1830s, there's a lot of railroad charters that get established but don't get developed beyond the paperwork. Illinois has an example. This is the Illinois Central, and this was a state land grant railroad, but the Illinois Central was one of many railroads that got chartered in that state. And for a period of time in the 1830s, Illinois was not exactly friendly to railroad development and promotion because they had all these people come in and want to build railroads, and then the Panic of 1837 hit, and they all walked away. So there was a little bit of work to build back that enthusiasm, particularly in the middle western states. Illinois used their land. They had a lot of state-owned land. They were not alone in doing that. And we see the checkerboard pattern of land development that they gave to the railroads in hopes that the railroad would get settlement, which would cause these lands to become developed and turn into farms or factories. Missouri did the same thing. And the idea being, you know, we've got this manifest destiny. We're going to spread, quote unquote, Western civilization, American, European-based civilization between the East Coast and the Pacific. And we're going to do this by bringing these people out of the congested cities on the East and get them settled. And in some cases, you know, people are thinking of Jefferson's idea of a nation of farmers and small business people. And let's do that by using all of this land that we've acquired through purchase or acquisition and develop it. And that that resonates with a lot of people. States have varying degrees of success. Illinois has a lot of success with the Illinois Central. Missouri, in some situations had some success, but also you had some panics that hit that caused curtailment of Western development. And you also had competitive railroads. This is the Ohio and Mississippi. This is a railroad that ran from Cincinnati, Ohio to what was called Illinois Town, but it's today known as East St. Louis in Illinois, just across the river from us here in St. Louis. It was competing with railroads in northern Ohio and central Ohio and northern Indiana and central Indiana and the same northern Illinois and central Illinois, and they're all trying to get to the Mississippi River. And they're all kind of angling to connect with some East Coast trunk line and get immigrants and manufactured goods and prosperity into these not overly developed areas of the country just yet. This poster, the Ohio Mississippi poster, is really interesting. The agent is in Boston, and it's in 1855, and they're getting people to go to western and southern bound passengers. So we're thinking Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, Texas, Nebraska to a certain extent, and you see, you know, what rivers they're pointing out: the Cumberland and the Arkansas rivers. So they're really heavily promoting this eastern settlement. It's also interesting, this is happening Boston, 1855, Bleeding, Kansas. How many of these trains had boxes that had Beecher's Bibles in them? So very, very interesting poster in the collection. Unfortunately, I didn't have room to put it up in that case, so that's why we're putting it in this presentation. Now, 1855, we've passed over an event that really kind of settled the shape of the United States in the 1850s, and that's the Mexican-American War, where now we have positions on both the northern Pacific and the southern Pacific coasts, and the country that is the lower 48 United States is pretty well established. And this is another case where defense shows up as a need to put people on trains in addition to settlement. The U.S. government decides we need to build a railroad so that if we ever have to hold this territory for any reason, we're going to be able to move troops by train. And part of that was the experience of moving troops by boat and road in the war previously, and how difficult it was, and also you know, the need to get people into these areas and Americanize them to a certain extent. So the Army is tasked with picking where we're going to put our one transcontinental railroad, because at the time, sectional divisions in Congress had prevented that from being decided in DC. So the Army sent out their civil engineers, their topographic engineers. They hired scientists to go with them, botanists, biologists, ornithologists, astronomers, meteorologists, geologists, and they surveyed several routes. They had a northern route that went from Chicago and Milwaukee to the Seattle area. They had a central route that was going to go from St. Louis to San Francisco. They had a slightly southern route that went from Fort Smith, Arkansas to Los Angeles. And they had a southern route that went from Los Angeles to New Orleans. They had another survey where they looked at building a road or a railroad along the Pacific coast. And all of these young Army officers, all the brightest that the Army could get, and darn near all of them become two-star generals during the American Civil War. One of them is a guy named George McClellan. He was on the Northern Pacific route. They get their report and they send their maps, their drawings, their samples of rocks to researchers. There's a coordination center in Washington, D.C., where they produce the final map, which is here. And is actually, we have a copy of that on display at the club. That's not the only surveying that's underway. Private surveyors are going out. John C. Fremont from St. Louis really is trying to get that central route to work out so that he's got a straight line between St. Louis and San Francisco. And a lot of that is being supported by his father-in-law, who's Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton. In the South, you've got the Southern Pacific route is getting heavily surveyed. This is Gray's survey of the 32nd parallel route, which we have in the collection. Colonel Gray was going out on his own with the support of the Texas Western Railroad, which is going to become part of the Southern Pacific later on. And he did his own surveying to try and promote this route. And in fact, when the decision gets sent to the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi agrees that the Southern Pacific route is the one to build. Well, that doesn't exactly go over quite too well in the halls of the Senate, and the project gets shelved. But with all of this underway, the railroad development has been so steady, even with a couple of financial panics, that now you can get from New York to the Appalachian Mountains in a day. You can get to Richmond and point south in a day. And technology for motive power is improved. And it is a common fact of life now that you're going to travel by train if you can't afford it in the 19th century. We do have some further explorations. When the war breaks out in the Civil War breaks out in 1861, pretty much everything stops for a little bit, but soon you have the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. And once again, the survey teams start to go out. This is actually a later post-Civil War photo album of Alexander Gardner of the Kansas Pacific, which originally was started as the Union Pacific Eastern Division and was designed to link Kansas City, Missouri with the Union Pacific Railroad. The UP, their route was not one of the routes surveyed by the Army, and it was the 41st parallel. So if you wanted to connect with them, you had to build some kind of connecting railroad, and this was going to be Kansas City's attempt. And that will be completed in 1869. And as of May 10th, you can take a train from the East Coast to the West Coast. What you see on the left is the timetable for the May 10th opening of the Union Pacific that took you from Omaha, Nebraska to Promontory, Utah. And then you would have had to transfer over to the Central Pacific. And this became a thing to do. You could now safely go and see the wild frontier of the American West. And companies like Jackson and Sharp, which built passenger cars in Wilmington, Delaware, were very quick to take advantage of that and have excursions in Jackson and Sharp passenger cars to go and see the West with some of the notable people on the East Coast. And if you couldn't afford the travel on your own, you were able to get descriptions via guidebooks and travel logs. This is one of the pieces we have at the library. We've got quite a few. It became a cottage industry after the completion of the railroad for people to go out and write about their train trip along the Transcontinental Railroad. And one reason why that was so popular is that's the cutting edge of technology, going to a place very few people have ever been or would be able to go to on their own. And in another talk about railroad photography I gave, this is equivalent to an astronaut writing about a trip to the moon. You know, it's high tech. You're going somewhere that very few people are going to go, and you're writing about what you're seeing and taking providing images. Now, this is all well and good for a handful of people, but you know, there's only so many very wealthy people that are going to take these excursion trips. The railroads need to make money consistently to be viable, and they start to lower prices. Now, your accommodations aren't going to be as nice as some of those excursion cars, but they start advertising settlement in the West. This is actually a German advertisement that was done by Scheel and Company in New York, but the market was the German immigrant who'd come over from Central Europe after the revolutions of 1848, had settled on the East Coast, and they were unhappy in the city. So let's, you know, come out west. The land is cheap. You know, look at the streams. You've got schools, you've got churches, you've got great scenery. You know, isn't this the place to be? And this was not a standalone thing. The Central Pacific, the Union Pacific's, we'll say frenemy, was also promoting Western settlement, even though to get to them at this time, you had to take the Union Pacific. They wanted people to come to California, and they were expanding their empire in California. They wanted people to go into the Central Valley. They wanted to promote the fact that you could go even further west. You can get to San Francisco and take a trip, or go, you know, to Japan or China and try your hand at business over there, and ship all of the goods you were able to acquire back on the Central Pacific to the markets of the East Coast. This is something that becomes a common advertising program for these Western railroads, not just the Central Pacific, but the Northern Pacific, the Rio Grande, the Southern Pacific, and Union Pacific, all try to promote the scenic wonder, the adventure, the opportunity of the West. And they use a lot of imagery to do that. Now, by the 1870s, when this is all underway, railroads are everywhere in this country. The Civil War is over. The railroads of the South have been rebuilt. There's been a lot of infill railroad development in the United States, and it's extremely complicated to take a train anywhere. So those Appleton's guides that I had showed earlier, that had all that civic pride, you know, population, industries, that's been replaced now by the Traveler's Official Guide to the Railways. And this is the Traveler's Bible. If you're going to plan a trip, this is what you need. It gives you every passenger train in every city in the United States, and it's updated regularly by the railroad to provide accurate information. This is, you know, before the internet, before you could call a travel agent, before you could call the railroad and ask what the schedules were. this was it. And this is what you would use to plan your trip, even if you're not going on business or if you're going on a vacation. Where can I take sleeping cars? Who's got dining car service? Well, we've got sleeping cars on the Atlantic and Gulf. And all of that is available in these guides. Now, we still have land development going on, particularly in the post-Civil War South. So you do still see these advertisements. That's going to start to ebb significantly. You do have some areas that get opened up for settlement late, like the free land of what is today Oklahoma's Panhandle. But for the most part, by 1880, 1890, when Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis saying the frontier is gone, the land grants really start to fade. They are still there. There is still railroad land, significant portions of railroad land. In fact, when some of the mergers took place in the 20th century, railroads were having to figure out what are we going to do with all this extra land we've got. Now, you do also have the quality of the trip becomes a selling point in addition to the destination. So this is one of the pieces we have in the collection. This is the Pullman Map that shows all the railroad lines in the United States that you can use a sleeping car on, a Pullman sleeping car. They do not have a monopoly yet, so you do have competitors. But this was something that they would promote to get people to say, oh, well, Pullman's quality, their reputation is such that I want to only take Pullman cars. Or if I want the best availability of Pullman cars, I want to take advantage of that. And you can also see from this map just how widespread railroads are. So you've got railroads across the continent. You've got a very complicated railroad network. And you've got a very complicated set of railroad schedules. And let me throw in something else that's going to make things even more complicated. Everybody has a different local noon to set those schedules by. And that's going to be something that's going to need to change. This is going to be a huge help to the traveler. And it starts getting played around with in the 1860s by a school teacher in upstate New York. And it's not until the 1870s that the railroads finally get together and say, okay, we do need to divide up the country into some kind of standardized time zones. And in 1883, in November, you have something called the Day of Two Noons, which is where time zones are finalized and they are enacted. And it finally allows standardization and connection of railroad schedules between various railroads that may have in the past had different local noons. A New York noon is different than Cleveland. And it may only be 15 minutes, it may be 45 minutes at any given time, depending on the quality of the astronomer's instruments and the clocks and whether or not you can do a good sunshot. That ends when time zones come into play. And this is what we have today. It starts with the ocean-going ships in the 18th century, and finally in the 19th century, it makes its way to railroads to use time for scheduling, and standardizing of it is a huge help for the traveler. And that allows now you can go from St. Louis to Boston and not have a misconnection anymore, thanks to just having two different time zones with the scheduling. And we do see some later railroad development in the upper Midwest. This is a Northern Pacific marketing brochure from Norwegian settlement. And as the 19th century keeps going, marching towards the 20th, the promotion for railroad land increases because the railroads do want to get this off the books. And the opportunity is still sold to a point that people are willing to travel in conditions like this for days on end and have to stop at lunch facilities where if, shall we say, the proprietors were less than scrupulous, the engine crews were told, you know, maybe set your clocks ahead a little bit and get out of here just a little fast, and that way we can reuse the food. That's not going to change until a guy named Fred Harvey shows up and really starts looking at the traveler's experience in the United States, particularly from a food standpoint, and saying this needs to be fixed. And the Harvey meal service, which was available to all passengers on the Santa Fe eventually, if you could pay for it, you could have a Harvey meal, and the quality was quite good. So you could be a middle-class passenger or a passenger going to the West to try your luck on new lands and not have a lot of pocket money and still get food that would be just as good as what the folks in the first class car would have. And eventually you're going to be able to dine on the train while it's moving. And that convenience and speed becomes a big factor. Let's also not forget, looking at these images, comfort also becomes a selling point with railroads, and they start to become obsessive about engineering comfort. We had mentioned Pullman with their sleeping cars. Most sleeping cars were quite utilitarian with racks of bunks. But if you had enough money, you could have Pullman make you a hunting car or a private car. And Pullman had their own catalogs that would let you do this. So it would have your own facilities in a car. This is actually a car built by American Car and Foundry for Brazil. Here's one of their private cars built in the 1920s. That's what the inside looked like. So the amount of luxury that you could have on an American railroad train was commensurate with whatever you could afford. And by the late 19th century, early 20th, what are you going to be doing? The West has pretty much been settled. If you're not traveling for business and you're part of the burgeoning middle class, you're going to start looking at traveling for fun. And railroads, particularly on the East Coast, start looking at resorts. And this is the Lehigh Valley promoting their routes to the upstate New York to go to Niagara Falls or the Adirondack Mountain or the Catskills. The Western railroads, the Maine Central, all promote the same thing. And the railroads themselves, after seeing the need to invest in improved railroad cars, improved locomotives, start building together in partnership great railroad stations that are either going to be union stations like we see here in St. Louis, or a massive station like Grand Central in New York, which could accommodate hundreds and hundreds of trains a day. Or they're going to start updating their small town facilities like this small community in Ohio. It's not a big station, but it's neat and presentable. And you're looking at a uniform passenger experience. You're looking at freight being kept out of the weather. You're looking at express and mail being protected. And you're providing the community with the needs to access your services. So they will use your railroad, particularly if you've got a competitor in the same town, over another. And occasionally you're going to have some high profile visitors, because if you're the president of the United States, if you're going to go anywhere outside of Washington, you're generally going to need to take a train. It's ironic that this is a Roosevelt timetable, because by 1907, 2 years after this timetable was published, I doubt you'd find a railroad president in the United States that had much civil to say about Teddy Roosevelt. And still here we have someone promoting, in this case, the Rio Grande, fertile lands in Colorado. By this point, the land market's been played out, unless you're going to start developing infrastructure with irrigation and improved fertilizer production, or you're going to have some kind of crop that's going to grow in the climate you're dealing with. Because the very fertile land got taken up very early. So you're looking at secondary land availability, like areas in Colorado that they do get developed, but you do have to do a lot of work to make the soil prepared to do this. So we're now in the early 20th century. We do have one big change in railroad travel that's going to happen in this decade, in the 19 teens, and this is World War I. A lot of people now are no longer traveling for fun. They're traveling because they're going to training camps or they're going to ports of embarkation. And this is a timetable, a dispatcher's record from the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. And you've got dozens of trains here running throughout the day. And you can see here, several of them are troop trains. And this is a symptom of a problem that happens where the railroad network sees so much traffic that it's actually overtaxed and almost collapses on itself and gets federalized. There will be some recovery afterwards, and that's a different talk. So that by the post-World War I era, the railroads are back on their own, but they've got some equipment that's kind of worn out. They're looking to rebuild. You see new locomotives, more powerful locomotives. You do see the return of the excursion train, the special train. You see the embracing of electrification to straight up replace steam power in certain areas. You see vacation travel return. And you see that by 1930, you can now get across the entire continent in 3 days. And there are multiple options for you to take. And all the competition now is about passenger speed, passenger comfort, passenger safety. And you start seeing the railroads really invest in dining car service to make that even better. Everybody gets to eat off China. You see streamlined locomotives show up, like these Dreyfus Hudsons at LaSalle Street in Chicago. You see the diesel locomotive show up in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And that gets heavily promoted to get the passenger onto the railroads, away from the car, which is starting to become a major competitor at this point, and try and get the industry back into that period, place of total dominance for the traveling public. And you see a lot of investment in the 1930s, some of it from the United States government in railroad infrastructure. This is the Pennsylvania Railroad Electrification brochures. That was completed using a Reconstruction Finance Corporation loan. So if you take Amtrak between New York and DC, you can thank John Barriger being the railroad examiner for that to help get that project done, which the Pennsy promptly then paid off after the project was finished. Now, one thing that railroads were able to bring in that the automobile did not yet have was air conditioning. This is a 1930s timetable for the Cotton Belt. They're promoting their new air conditioning equipment, which you could not get in a car at the time. They're also promoting the economy of their meal service. Also, if you do have some kind of mishap on a train trip, you do have nurse attendants that were aboard most of the top flight passenger trains of multiple railroads. That actually stays in place until after World War II. And you do see still railroads are promoting where their trains go and the things you can see out the window. And this is pretty steady during the Great Depression, right before World War I starts. You see diesel showing up. You see the traffic starting to rebound a little bit. And then that all goes away with World War II. And again, everybody's traveling for some other reason. You start seeing posters, is this trip necessary? Give up space to service people who are home on furlough. And the railroads do quite well with moving government passengers, And after the war, they think everybody's going to come back to the railroads. And so companies like the Santa Fe re-equipped the Super Chief, as you see in this 1950 print. The Great Northern re-equips the Empire Builder. But unfortunately, Americans by this point are so wedded to their cars that the passenger train starts to decline. And it declines quickly enough. I mean, the interstate highway system is a big factor. The airlines are a big factor. That takes away the mid to long distance trip that a railroad could really promote and say, you know, we can get you these long distances over across the country instead of having to drive your car over inadequate highways with not necessarily the necessary infrastructure to do what you need to do to travel from one coast to the other. When Eisenhower starts putting the interstate highway system and the air network gets really developed, that starts to go away. So you start seeing the need for railroads to eliminate passenger service. Trains start getting canceled. Amtrak gets established in the 1970s. Originally, it was basically going to be the graceful exit of the passenger train. The oil crisis changed that. And they did continue to invest in new technology, such as the turbo train. But they still maintained the established routes that many passengers had seen, such as up in Connecticut and upstate New York. And they were continuing to promote to the traveler, although now pretty much outside of the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak's traveler is a vacation traveler. So that's the market, the family going on vacation. And that's, for the most part, the market that Amtrak still uses to this day. Again, outside of the Northeast Corridor. And they promote the destination. And the equipment's still running. This is actually one of the older types of locomotives Amtrak still has. And they still run in every kind of weather, despite, this was actually 4 years ago in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is where I live. And it was not a day for cars, but Amtrak didn't seem to have much trouble driving, much trouble running in that weather. So despite all of the challenges that we've seen with railroads over the past 100 years, or 100, actually now 200 years, the passenger train is still running along. You can still travel across the country on Amtrak, not nearly as much as you used to be able to, but they're still around, and it's still an experience that I highly recommend everybody enjoy. So I will happily open up for questions here. And again, please, the exhibition closes in 11 days. You have 10 days left of time to see it. It closes on July 30th, which is Saturday. And then we actually have to start taking things down on Monday, August 1st. So if you haven't had a chance and you're in the New York area and you'd like to see some of these pieces and other items in real life, please go up to the Grolier Club and you do have to make reservations because we're still living with COVID, but they're happy to get that set up for you. So I saw a lot of Q&As pop up, so I will hand it off to that. And thank you everyone for your attention and my 89 slides.
Nick, thank you so much. You literally took us on a whistle-stop tour of North America, and it was so fascinating. You covered so many things. Now, we do have a lot of questions to get through in a short time. So I'll just say, Victoria, if there's anything you would like to add before I open up the Q&A? Victoria, you're on mute.
Nick, thank you. That was a glorious look at travel. And yet again, I always say, I look back to our past with great gratitude for all of the work that's come before us. And when just looking at the way rail travel developed and all of the work and ingenuity, engineering, great American spirit of development, and you have helped us with our appreciation of rail travel. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well said, Victoria. Okay, I'm also going to emphasize that the Grolier exhibit is on July 30th. I think I did post a link in the chat, which I hope most of the audience got. And of course, I just want to mention again that there is a lecture tomorrow. It's Nick's third lecture connected to the exhibit. It's entitled Tycoons, Men, Money, and Monuments. You can register for at the Grolier Club for that lecture. Though I did see a later comment saying it might be fully booked at the moment, but there is a waiting list. Is that what you believe? Is that what you believe, Nick?
Yeah, they have a limited number of Zoom seats. I don't think they've got I don't think they've got a 1,000-seat subscription because Zoom has different plans. So yeah, I think they can handle about 100. And the last one, they had to open up a YouTube link to handle the overflow. So they may do that again.
Well, there you go. And I also want to mention that their lecture will also be posted on their website at a later point, even if they don't do that. So it will still be possible to see that. So, Nick.
Karen, may I ask, can I just go line with one question? Nick, what ignited your interest in this subject?
It goes back to when I was 6 years old and got my first toy train. I think a lot of folks who are into railroads have some childhood core memory that involves a positive experience with the train, be it a family member or going to see a railroad museum with an operating locomotive. In my case, I grew up outside. I grew up in Central Maryland, so we had railroads formed this triangle around where I grew up. And we would go places, and trains were interesting to me. It's a giant machine that stayed on a track, and it went by, and people were in it. They would wave at you when you were in the car waiting for it to go by. And I had family members in 2 generations back that had worked for the railroad. So it was in the family. My grandfather had toy trains. My father had model trains. And when I got old enough that I could handle model trains, I was given my first train set, and it just kind of stuck with it. It was a family memory and just positive memories. And then I got into history, and being where I was, I literally grew up within 5 miles of the first railroad line in the United States. The old main line of the B&O. So it was there all the time.
Right.
Great to know. Thank you, Nick. Now, I do apologize if I don't get your question, and in fact, it's inevitable I won't get to all the audience's questions because we've got quite a few, but I will also send them all to Nick afterwards. Nick, this is from Alicia Nancinio. How much was the ticket to go across? Now, I suppose it depends what decade it was in the century, but could you give us the audience a rough idea of how much the most inexpensive and expensive tickets were at a certain point in time?
So immigrant class tickets were, and this kind of goes back to, and this I'm building off of some things I learned when I visited Ellis Island. When you emigrated, when Ellis Island was in operation, you had to have $50 to your name, which partially showed that you could get out of New York. So for a lot of the 19th century, the cost was under $50 to get a train ticket out of New York and go west. How far west you went determined how much it was going to cost. A lot of the railroads were advertising in the 30s, $30 to $40 range to go in immigrant class from the beginning of their lines in Omaha or St. Louis or Chicago to go west. And it changes over time. And in some cases, that cost is going to be subsidized by an immigrant aid society. In some cases, a company is going to subsidize it if they need workers or they're actively recruiting workers. They will buy the ticket for you, so it won't cost you anything. In today's dollars, I mean, it would have been several $100s. I have to pull the actual dates and run the the inflation calculator to get the number, but you know, for first class, I think it worked out to like $3,000 to $5,000 to go across the country in the 19th century in one of those really nice Pullman accommodations with your meals taken care of.
Right. So
Excursions.
so relatively expensive. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But it did look like they certainly had wonderful luxury when they traveled.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. How was the standard gauge finally decided, and by whom? How did they reach that decision? This is from Dan Noah.
In the United States, a lot of us went with a lot of the railroads went with George Stephenson's gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. And his was an engineering compromise based off of existing horse-drawn wagons that were used on the early railways in Britain. But he modified it a little bit to help reduce wear and strain on the wheels. So it's an engineering compromise. In the United States, we settle on 4 feet 8.5 inches because the main East Coast railroads went with the British engineering standards because it seemed to work over there. We had in New York, you certainly had the broad gauge Erie Railroad, and here in St. Louis, we had the Ohio and Mississippi and the Pacific Railroad. That all gets standardized in 1875, and they physically changed the gauge of the entire railroad network over the course of, I think, 3 days, where everybody who was not 4 feet 8.5 inches, they narrow their gauge manually to match everything. And there's several articles in the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society magazine that talk about that process. And in our case, it was mainly economic based because the railroads that were dominant in the United States influenced other railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was built at 4 feet 8.5 inches because it wanted to connect with the railroads that went to New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. So that's basically how we did it. And it was not a government standard laid down. The British railroads were all standardized under the Gauge Act, but ours, it was economics.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, as it were, combine two questions, which is really about the railroad in a now contemporary. Was there significant investment in modern railroad infrastructure by local, state, or federal governments, as happened later with the interstate highway system and government-built airports? That's from James Gray. And a similar question is, and this is really about the future, what do you think is the future of the transcontinental trains? The contributor points out, like for instance, the Superline trainers, some of them are 40 years old and showing their age. Will the government fund updated equipment?
All right, well, we'll start with the first one. The original railroads had significant local and state government support. In fact, many of those railroads, the state either provided guarantees on the bonds that financed them, or owned bonds or stocks or a combination of that outright. And they would also sell subscriptions to individual communities that were going to benefit from the railroad. So the city of Philadelphia, the city of New York, the city of Boston, the city of Buffalo, city of Richmond, the city of, they'd all be asked, do you want to buy part of the railroad that's going to benefit? And they would do that because they were thinking this is going to help us stay economically and commercially relevant. As for today, I mean, you see a lot of state support from Amtrak. And in fact, that's a funding model that was pushed out in the past 20 years where states are supporting more of their local trains. As for the long distance trains, if we want them as a society, they will find a way. I can't imagine, and mainly because for the past 44 years, there's always been a long distance train you can take across the country. I can't imagine a country where you couldn't do that in the United States, or I can't imagine the United States where you couldn't do that. But it's going to take a lot of political and popular support to make it happen. And that's where we run into trouble with Amtrak. It sometimes has very good political support and sometimes doesn't. And that will directly affect whether or not you're going to still have long distance trains. Fortunately, it seems that the local communities that use them really do an effective job of letting their congressional representatives know, we need this, we use this, please do what you can to help that. But there is a big bill coming. There's a big bill because that entire fleet needs to be replaced and upgraded. And there's going to be some sticker shock. And so,
Right.
we'll see. I certainly don't mind paying a little bit more so that stays in place, but not everybody says that.
Thank you. Do you have, Nick, you yourself, do you have a favorite period in a railway development?
I find the 20 years between 1850 and 1870 to be extremely interesting, both from an economic history side, but also we're still trying out a lot of technology. The telegraph is still a novel thing at that time, and it also coincides with some pretty major developments of the railroad industry, where you get the Transcontinental Railroad approved, you get the railroad surveys, you get the infill in the Midwest. And for me, in growing up near the Baltimore and Ohio, that was an extremely turbulent time for the B&O Railroad, where a lot of hijinks and shenanigans are going on at a corporate level that make for extremely interesting reading. So from a historian standpoint, I really enjoy reading through stuff like that. And that is my favorite era.
Thank you. I'm going to take a final question. And as I said, I do apologize to our audience because obviously there are many questions I was not able to get to this evening and ask Nick, but I will forward him all your comments and questions. So this is actually, Nick, this is from Michelle Boyd. Can you talk about the Barriger, just briefly about the Barriger Collection and how to access its resources?
Yes, the Barriger Collection consists of about 30,000 volumes of books, over a mile of archival material, books and journals, and a mile of archival material. It is held at the University of Missouri St. Louis in our library collection here. If you do want to come out and visit us in person, you're more than welcome to. We do recommend you call ahead so we can make sure everything you're interested in is here. The catalog is online. We're part of the U of M system. You can also find our holdings via WorldCat, which is the library consortium catalog that's global. We do interlibrary loan for certain pieces in the collection, so you don't have to come out here. We have several thousand of our images online via a Flickr page that we maintain. We have several thousand of our documents and archival materials available via our Missouri Digital Library access point that also you don't have to fly out here to visit. And if you do have something that maybe it's not that long and we can scan it for you, you can contact me and our reference team here and we can help you out. The website you want is UMSL at Uniform Mike Sierra Lima.edu/Barriger. And that'll take you to our webpage. And you can access the library catalog from there, the Flickr page, and the Missouri Digital Library. And if you are interested in any of the other holdings we've got a steamboat collection. There is some interaction between railroads and steamboats. That's also accessible there. And the collections of the St. Louis Mercantile Library.
Thank you. Well, I have to say the Flickr page sounds particularly enticing. And for the audience, we will, when I send out the video link, I will also send out the link that Nick just mentioned, so you can go and visit the Barriger Collection. So, well, Nick, really, we are so grateful to you for sharing your, vast expertise would be an actual understatement of your incredible knowledge about railways and rail lines. And it's just been so fascinating. Obviously you covered how America was settled, in addition to covering recreation travel so eloquently. So on behalf of the General Society, I think Victoria will say a few words. I just want to express our huge gratitude to you, and to finally remind the public, our audience tonight, please do consider going and finding time to see this wonderful exhibit currently at the Grolier Club. Victoria?
Nicholas, we're just grateful that that 6-year-old boy fell in love with trains, and that your family nurtured that love and that interest, and that it turned into all of what you gave us all tonight. You're really a gift to your industry and to the subject that deserves your rich attention and intelligence. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to everyone tonight. And I'm happy to help anyone who's still got questions. It's what I like to do. I like to talk this stuff, and it's fun. So
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick, because you will be receiving quite a few additional questions that we didn't get to tonight. And this is obviously a tremendously popular topic, and we just want to express our gratitude to you again for sharing your knowledge and expertise. To our online audience, thank you so much for attending. This is the final summer lecture, but of course we will be back in the fall and look forward to seeing you then. So again, many thanks, Nick, and good night to everyone. Good night.